Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dana Shoaf, the editor of Civil War Times Magazine, and I am a co-host today for the program My Voice, My Pen, Interpreting African American History. And there are four special guests here we're going to be talking to for the next hour or so, and I'm sure it's going to prove to be fascinating. And co-hosting this event with me is going to be Dr. James Broomall from Shepherd University.
Thank you so much, Dana, and thank you all for tuning in on what is, at least where I am, an absolutely lovely afternoon. Before we get into the program today, we acknowledge our speakers. I do want to thank a number of different organizations. Of course, my friend Dana at Civil War Times created this idea, made the contacts, and sort of helped to realize the event. And so I think it's going to be a fun conversation. The Harpers Ferry Park Association co-hosted the event, as did the Loudon Museum. Not Your Mama's History, thank you. And Civil War Trails Incorporated has been a longtime partner for us, and in particular, really helped to sort of boost the publicity for this event today. So thank you all very much. Facebook is a very busy place these days, and so sort of getting word out for programming is often difficult. So we deeply appreciate everything. And as Dana said, I am a professor of history at Shepherd University, and I am the director of the George Heather Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Dana, and we're going to have some fun today.
Yes, we are. So I thought we might start out with describing the organization for everybody, because some people may not be familiar with the Sons and Daughters of Ham. So let me talk about that briefly. This is mostly called from their Facebook page, which you should check out if you haven't done so. But the Sons and Daughters of Ham is a 501c3 organization of living historians dedicated to recreating the lives and legacies of African Americans living in pre-war and Civil War America through educational living histories and reenactments. The name of their organization was inspired by the poem The Colored Soldiers by Paul Laurence Dunbar, whose father served in the 55th Massachusetts Colored Infantry. Dunbar used the term "those noble sons of Ham" to describe soldiers of the United States colored troops. Ham was a biblical character who is widely recognized as the father of the Black race. The organization engages in interpretive activities that include many aspects of the daily lives of those who were enslaved and free during the period. They strive for continuous learning with the goal of achieving improvement with each event that they undertake. Through educational living histories, reenactments, and public lectures, the Sons and Daughters portray and interpret the story of their ancestors in the 19th century. The group's membership is made up of people of African descent from all walks of life and age groups. So we've got that here today. So let's meet some of the members of the Sons and Daughters of Ham. We'll start going through alphabetically. Marvin-Alonzo Greer, if you want to give a wave and let people know. Marvin graduated from Morehouse College. He worked at Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg, as a supervisor of the Peyton Randolph House, and he is currently the Education and Visitor Experience Lead at Soldiers Memorial Military Museum in St. Louis. I haven't been there, but looking at the website, it looks like an amazing place. George Hardy is a former account manager and capture manager in a Fortune 500 company, currently leading an IT startup as an entrepreneur. He received his undergraduate at Howard University. There was a little back and forth about Howard and Morehouse, and the University of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He pursued postgraduate studies at Wesley Theological Seminary. George and I have been friends a long time. George has been doing living history since 1988, and I realized I started doing events with George about 30 years ago, which was sort of, made my bones ache. But George is, among his other activities, George is keeping busy chopping up his beautiful silk ties into these handsome masks that help people prevent the spread of COVID. And I'm a proud owner of this dark blue houndstooth. It's probably the nicest piece of clothing I own, actually. It's silk. So George is a man of many talents. Mia Marie has been involved in living history and interpretation for over a decade. Her work includes historical interpretation at Colonial Williamsburg, 2 seasons of acting on the historical drama TV series Turn, and she uses her love of storytelling to teach African American history. She resides abroad in Ireland with her husband. She's coming to us from the Emerald Isle, and she's going to relocate to France this summer to pursue graduate school and a career as a culture and diversity specialist. Last but not least, Cheyney McKnight graduated from Simmons University in Boston and majored in political science. She is the living history coordinator at the New York Historical Society, a place I think is just fabulous. It's a fabulous place, where she develops living history programming, trains historical interpreters, and oversees living history programs. She also owns and operates Not Your Mama's History, which also has a Facebook page that you should check out, a consulting firm that aids historic sites in talking about race and slavery in 18th and 19th century America through staff trainings and exhibit consulting. She considers herself an activist who uses her historical interpretation skills to have real conversations about slavery and race with people. Now I'm going to screen share, and it was a little bulky when we did this earlier, so let me hope it goes a little smoother, and I hope everyone can see this image. I wanted to start out showing the sons and daughters of Ham in their interpretive element. This is the first time that I saw the organization personally. This was in 2015 at a reenactment at Bentonville, North Carolina. I was a federal soldier. I had just thrown my knapsack down, and I turned around and I saw these people come through the North Carolina scrub, and I just was frozen. I had never seen anything like this in historical interpretation before, and I couldn't take my eyes from it. I was riveted. A federal picket met the group at the edge of the camp and escorted them to the federal headquarters where the dialogue began. And you can see Marvin here with the axe over his shoulder, Cheyney and George right here. Mia is not in this particular image, but we do have other images of her interpreting, and we'll show those later. But this was spellbinding to me. So to start out for our viewers, some general questions. How did you all meet, and how did you decide to embark upon this avenue of interpretation that could be considered controversial? And I'll stop the share here.
So Dana, I'll take that question. Thank you for having us. All of us are grateful to be part of this program because we all love to share history, especially African American history and culture, which is intrinsically part of American history. So how we all met is quite a long story, so I'll make it as short as possible. But Cheyney and I actually went to middle school together. And we were friends. We lost contact over the years, but thanks to social media and Facebook, we were able to keep in touch. And we kept in touch off and on. But so that's kind of how we initially met. But it was not through reenacting or living history or anything historical whatsoever. Mia and I met on an early social media post called Living History Worldwide that some of you.
That's right.
Might remember from years back, and it was great because I didn't know many African American living historians or reenactors in my age group, and so we were able to connect online, and we became friends quickly, and we met at a few events off and on. Either she was interpreting or I was interpreting, and so we would run into each other, but we never really got a chance to interpret together. And right. George and I met. Actually, not through the Civil War field, but through World War II and World War I living history and reenacting. As you said, Dana, George has been reenacting since decades ago, and when it comes to living history and historical interpretation, George really has set the gold standard for what it means to be a Black living historian. Not just wearing the clothing, not just being able to talk to people, but really having that context of where these different time periods meet and why history matters. In 2013, at the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, Mia and I were discussing going to the battle, and we wanted to recreate the African American community of Gettysburg that had to flee in. As Robert E. Lee's army came in, because one of the first things they did was kidnap and sell into slavery both free and free African Americans as well as people of color who had escaped enslavement and were living free. At the time, George was so high up on the pedestal, I was too afraid to ask him. So we did not, unfortunately, we did not invite George to that event. However, Cheyney ironically reached out to me out of the blue a month before the program and said, hey, are you still reenacting? Are you still dressing up? I want to get involved. And I was kind of like, you know, like reenacting's expensive, getting the stuff together expensive. Like you can join us, but you know, you're not, there's no way you'll ever be able to get like, there's no way you'll ever be able to get ready in time. And Cheney was like, try them if you want to. And within a month, from head to toe, Cheney looked the part of a Black refugee from Gettysburg who was trying to flee. So myself, Cheney, and Mia, another one of our friends and members of the Sons and Daughters of Ham, Andy Finley, he brought out his nephew, Doug, and we recreated this experience. Later on that year, George and I met face to face at a World War I event. He said he saw our pictures. We kind of talked about his love for the American Civil War and his passion for it. And his dream was to create a group. And I was like, well, we already have the people. Let's just make this a reality. And so we took this idea and we took people that were already interested. Being a Black living historian, it can be a very lonely experience, especially if you're interested in the authentic experience of it and doing it correctly. And so having like-minded people to talk to act as a support network, and to really build each other up and help build up our community was one thing that really drew us all together.
And before Jim takes a few questions, how many members are there in your organization?
Ooh, I think around 20 so far.
Yeah.
And we, again, like you said, we are all over the country and all over the world, as far away as Ireland.
Right.
I think I'm the farthest west, being in St. Louis, and all up and down the eastern seaboard. So most living history organizations are very localized in a state or a region, but we really span the entire world.
So I just wanted folks to be clear, you represent roughly a quarter of your organization. It's got quite a few more members, yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the background. I deeply appreciate it. And thank you all again for coming on the program today. Your time is valuable, and I think you're going to really provide some enlightening perspective here. Thank you to our viewers. We have quite a robust group here streaming in live, well over 100 at this point. Many of your friends and our friends are acknowledging, and I'll give a shout out, but there's too many names to list here. So just hello, friends. Thank you all for tuning in. And I want to start with something that goes a bit deep here into the fabric of American society, and that is indeed that there's this central paradox, this contradiction that has existed really since 1619. And if you want to go back to the European experience and beyond, we can certainly do that. But for the American experience, at least since 1619, there has been the concurrent rise of racism and equality. In many ways, white English liberty was dependent upon the enslavement and subjugation of Africans and African Americans. And this is baked into our fabric. It has been distilled by historians such as Edmund Morgan in his famous book, American Slavery, American Freedom. It's often given voice when scholars talk about Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the holder of enslaved peoples. And so I think to sort of start us off here, how, as public historians, do you address, explain, and discuss this enduring contradiction? And how have audiences in turn received your message?
That's a great question, James. So you can't talk about American history without talking about this paradox, like you were saying. At my time at Colonial Williamsburg, at Cheney's time, and at Mia's time when we were working there, that's really at least that's where I got to cut my teeth talking really about this paradox. I know Cheney did too, because we overlapped in our time at CW. And when you get to really discuss this idea of what is America, America was founded on the institution of slavery. There's no most of our founding fathers were enslavers. Almost all of them benefited in some way, shape, or form from the enslavement of African people and African Americans. And so slavery and racism is as American as apple pie. So you can't disconnect the one from the other. And I think as living historians, it's our job to really dive in, not just to 19th century history, which is our focus, but to look back to our founding, and then look as far as 2020, where we're living right now, and study how have how has racism, how has white supremacy played a role in American society since its inception? And looking back at how white Americans, how African Americans, how other Americans of all different walks of life have really talked about, debated, protested, and pushed back against inequality, and sharing these stories. I think when we engage with the public, people really do like to hear these firsthand accounts, see people discussing. It's not over the internet, but having these face-to-face connections with individuals and saying, "Let me tell you what life was like for African Americans in the 1860s and the 1850s," and then connecting the dots from the American Civil War and slavery to Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Movement to where we are today in the 21st century, and being able to lead guests on a guided discussion where they can make those connections, as opposed to where you might do it in a classroom where you have a short amount of time to fit in all of American history or a half of American history in a 30-minute section. We have a little bit more time and make it, I think, a little bit more enjoyable for our guests who are visiting, because that one-on-one connection, people feel free to ask questions. There are no dumb questions. There are, people who do think that they might have an ignorant question or something that might be racially tinged, we're able to diffuse those and kind of make that into an educational moment, instead of yelling at someone and saying, "You're a racist," but saying, "Okay, I hear you, but let's rephrase this conversation in a more productive manner."
I kind of pause on that point. I think it's an important one, and maybe we could sort of open it up to the group here. I spend most of my life behind a podium in a classroom, and it's a sort of mediated presentation. We of course delve into primary source materials, but what's so intriguing, I think, about your type of work is that it's in this public history environment that you nodded to a couple times, and so to me at least, I think certainly universities and colleges are productive places to discuss, but I think though I'm talking to a very specific group of people, whereas public historians, public history sites are attracting in many instances millions of visitors across the country. It's a lot more informal environment. And so the discussions seemingly can be much more conversational. I mean, has that been the case? And have there been sort of revelations that you've seen sort of unfold on the ground as you're doing this type of interpretation? I mean, it seems like a much more intimate, familiar environment, a much more human environment in some ways.
And so, Jim, you're speaking to one of my favorite books, and I have it here. Oh, by the way, this is a book. It's called Interpreting Our Heritage, and it's by a fellow named Freeman Tilden.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sure you're aware of it.
National Park Service, yeah.
I'm going to quote a couple of lines from the book in its very beginning. First off, he says, interpretation is a public service. And so it's a privilege for us to come out and to help educate the public. There are thousands of people every year who come out to National Park Service sites and other sites. And it's not, the benefit is not only what they see, but the interaction that they get from interpreters. He goes on to say, visitors are exposed. It's a kind of elective education that is superior in some respects to what they receive in the classroom. So whatever we've received through our academic environment, we need to go beyond that when we interpret history. History should come alive when a visitor comes to a site. They should see something that they won't see in the classroom, and they should hear something that pricks their imagination and their curiosity a little bit more. And so again, it's a public service, and we really embrace that role, and we really play off of that role and its importance.
I had a question. You mentioning historical sites, and I think when visitors come to historical sites, there's a bit of an expectation they're going to see perhaps people in costume, and it's somewhat expected. I know some of you have also done interpretation in urban areas where, people walking down the street are not going to expect to necessarily encounter any kind of costume and interpreter. And have you encountered different reactions in those different venues?
I'll take that. Yeah, I have encountered all types of reactions.
Because Cheney,
I
you do
think
this fairly often, correct?
yes. So I interpret in New York City, and I do a lot of interpretation actually on the street, trying to engage people and have real conversations. But one thing that I found to be very real is that people really want to know, and people have a lot of questions. And they're nervous about asking these questions, as Marvin said. They're worried that they're going to say something wrong, that they're going to offend me, that they're going to be accused of being a racist. So having someone to say, you know, I have this question, and you know, I don't know exactly how to explain it. I think I get a lot of those very positive interactions, and I always walk away feeling like that we really push the ball that much further. But at the same time, I do get a lot of pushback, but I think it's a lot different than engaging people in a classroom setting, or even on the internet, because they're looking at an actual descendant of these people. So some of these ideas that they come to the conversation with, when actually looking in my eyes or our eyes, it turns the conversation into a completely different direction. And I find that people are a little bit disarmed by historical clothing, as well as the presence of, I would like sometimes say, a representative of the ancestors. And I find that it really changes the conversation and how people interact. But sometimes it can be intense, especially when you're standing outside of a subway.
Oh,
It's something that it seems like people never expect either. Of perception of, oh, no one would do this. There's more questions, and you're able, as Cheyney said, it's a disarming moment, but it's also this beautiful curiosity of, wait, why? And it's really interesting, the responses you get.
Yeah.
having a little delay with your audio, Mia. Again, Mia is coming to us from Ireland, so you know, bear with that, everybody. But I think we all could understand the gist of her comment there.
Yeah, and thank you all. And building off of that, we actually have two questions that I could sort of combine, and it'll relate to what Cheyney and George have just said. And one comes from Heidi, Dana's wife, shout out to Heidi, and our friend Kyle over in Frederick. And what they've asked, though, we'll sort of be able to touch upon, I think, each of your perspectives. And part of the question is, what are some of the challenges, which I think Cheyney started talking about, what are some of the challenges associated with teaching African-American history? And then two, George, since you've accrued 30 plus years of experience in this arena, have public reactions changed over time? I mean, if you started some of your interpretive work in the late 80s, I mean, I'm just thinking where the scholarship was at that point, let alone what public audiences were often perceived.
Oh, yeah.
Entirely different world.
Yeah.
And so maybe we can offer some thoughts on that.
Sure. I'll take that question, Jim. Thank you. I would say, first off, we've come a long way in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And I'm proud to be a part of that evolution. And I started in 1988. I would say prior to 1988, enacting community was predominantly white males. Okay, and we didn't have a significant presence of African Americans until the movie Glory. Many of African Americans that joined the hobby around 1988 joined because they wanted to be extras in that movie. Mm-hmm. And the movie pricked an interest in them to the point where they wanted to continue interpreting the role of United States colored troops. Back in '88, back in the early '90s, in the civilian part of the hobby, you basically had families that, the wives and the children of some of the male reenactors, and they just wanted to tag along for the weekend. Okay. So, and so it wasn't a really focused or concerted effort to really investigate the civilian experience. Many times when you saw civilian reenactors, you saw the top hats and you saw the silk ball gowns, which represented the wealthy in our society. And to be more comprehensive, you have to go across all strata. You have to have a representation of the poverty. You have to have a representation of the working class. You have to have that representation also of the wealthy. And that was just not present in the 80s and in the 90s. And I think as time went on, as reenactors got a little bit older, they got tired of fighting battles, they got tired of marching and shooting, and they said, hey, I can still be involved in the hobby, but in a civilian role. And you started to see more emphasis being placed on interpreting, civilians. On the African American side, we were still at the time in the 80s and even in the 90s, really focused on the USC story. It's a story that needs to be told. It's a story that brought about a lot of pride within our community. And quite honestly, to go into the civilian realm for African Americans meant that you had to address the issue of slavery. And most of us were not prepared to do that, and we weren't excited about doing that. We were uncomfortable about that as the African American community. As we kind of matured in the hobby, I think at least several of us embraced the idea that if you're going to interpret this period, it's impossible to have the discussion without talking about those who were enslaved, those who were emancipated, those who emancipated themselves, and the presence of African Americans on the home front. I mean, we were everywhere. We were doing everything as we are today. 2015 comes around and I met these guys. And we all came to the collective conclusion that this is what needs to be told. Now, simultaneously, I believe with this generation, there's an emphasis on transparency. We want the details now. We want to dig down, drill down, and we want to talk about those subjects that may be uncomfortable. And this group is absolutely the right group to do that, because this group arms itself with the information. We're not afraid to go into those difficult spaces in terms of discussions, and the emphasis is on educating. How can we help what's going on today by educating a public that may have been reluctant to even have the discussion? So pretty much that's the evolution of it all. I would also add to that over the last 30 years, the vendor community has improved significantly. Back in the 80s and 90s, I would say 85 to 90% of the vendors focused on the military uniforms and military clothing. And that was to the neglect of civilian attire. Most of the civilian attire really focused on women's dresses. And now you've had that evolution even in the vendor community, where vendors are putting a lot more energy into making clothing for civilian men, women, and children. And so it makes it easier for us to interpret.
As you strive for accuracy, what sources do you rely on for your material culture? Are there a lot of good? I can think of some. Are there good images out there of the people that you're portraying?
First off, if you're talking about the clothing of the enslaved, it's a study within itself. I mean, you really have to dig down. There's a few rules that we go by, but then there's a few things that I would say are atypical. I mean, things that you wouldn't expect. In terms of having original artifacts, that's very difficult because this was work clothing. It wore out, it got cast off. Nobody wanted to keep it for any reason. And so we do rely very heavily on photographs, on descriptions from firsthand accounts. In general, we do a lot of research at museums. We go into museums, try to examine as many original artifacts as we can, original pieces of clothing. The auction houses these days have a great online presence, and they show detailed pictures of clothing that they have for auctions. That's been a really good source. I also look at period paintings by Mount and by Caleb.
William Sidney Mount.
Yeah. And they provide details as well. One of the things that has been exposed to me, at least, is the fact that the North really supported the South by providing clothing. There were boxes of boots, for example, that are called Negro brogans that were made in the North very cheaply and sent to the South just to support the slave market. Same thing with clothes. The ready-made clothing market in New York and Boston and northern cities sent clothing to the South to support the slave market. In addition to that, some clothing was actually imported from the British. And you can only imagine what that looked like if the Confederacy was importing what they called penitentiary clothing. You could probably determine that much of the clothing that was imported from Britain for the slave market was very much the same. Marvin found a piece and it had, I guess it was an original account of how the federal government was actually selling Mexican War jackets for the slave market down in Louisiana and down in the Deep South. So you would go to plantations and you would see scores of slaves with Mexican War jackets on. It's all kinds of things like that. Nothing that's really typical. And we have to portray all of that. So,
well, you continue talking. I'm going to screen share to an image of you at Harper's Ferry, kind of illustrating some of that material culture you're talking about. And you could, continue, Jim, with a question here.
Well, I just say more broadly too. I mean, I assume that archaeology continues to inform your interpretation as well. I mean, one of the things that's so powerful about archaeology is it's largely democratic, and so whereas only the smallest percentage of the clothing of the enslaved or even poor whites survives, a lot of the commonplace items that were utilized by the enslaved on plantations and farms in the South are eventually found in the dirt by archaeologists. And so there's some compelling evidence there. And I would urge our viewers, if you haven't, spend some time in the Library of Congress's photos and drawings section and prints. Images by Forbes, Wode, and other artists often portray, quote unquote contrabands moving through federal camps, portray enslaved peoples. And, I think you've really highlighted a lot of the different forms of evidence. If I could bounce it back to some of our viewers' questions, I'm going to try to, again, do a combination question from a couple different viewers. Again, some familiar names to you all. And I had imagined that we might have a large percentage of people who are working in public history. They themselves may be living historians or reenactors. And the question is sort of tiered. So the first part is, what advice might you have to public historians if they deal with maybe angered responses to the subject matters that you're discussing? And then the other part, which is interesting, especially Cheyney, given your work, how do you discuss, in many instances, in places that some audiences might seem are removed from slavery, the presence of either freed Blacks, enslaved peoples, or the economic linkages that George had just highlighted. So I know there's a lot there, but hopefully you can all sort of weigh in with your perspectives. And so again, just to break it down, how do you deal with those who are maybe unreceptive to your responses, or what advice might you have to other public historians? And then two, how do you discuss issues like race and slavery in places that, again, some public audiences might say we're not involved in the institution or the economics of it, which is not true?
Cheyney, take it away.
All right.
Go for it.
I think the first question, the advice would be to stay calm and really humanize the person that you are talking to. I think a lot of times when we interact with the public and we come across people who right off the bat are throwing in diversionary tactics such as, what about the white slaves? You don't see the Irish complaining about race today. Those are understanding where that's coming from. A lot of who we are based on the stories that we were taught. All the things that we learn from our families, our familial histories, and to have someone come up to you and say that this is what you were always told by the people you trust and love are wrong, and here's the evidence. You have to understand that this is like a sledgehammer has just been taken to the foundation of who they are. And so I usually use the steps of grief to really understand my interactions with the public. Understanding that you're not going to get someone from complete denial of the facts to acceptance in one interaction. But if you take a look at the stages of grief, maybe you could get someone from one level of grief to the next. You may be able to get them from complete denial into regret or sadness. And so being able to read that in guests is very important. So being able to read people, because you may have really changed someone's mind in a very small way, but because it's not in the huge way that you think it will be, you're going to miss those little changes and those little, that little bit of progress. And then also talking about, I'm in the North, I live in New York, and I was actually very surprised by how many people in the North don't know that the North also had enslaved persons. So New York specifically had New York City had the second largest enslaved population, only second to Charleston before the American Revolution. So they had a lot of enslaved persons, and it wasn't a kinder or gentler slavery. And we see this in newspapers, and from the period, we see this in court cases, as well as in journals, in narratives. So really bringing forth the words of people from the period is very helpful in educating different populations who aren't quite aware that both free Black people and as well as enslaved persons were in the area. So I interpret in Boston and Connecticut, all over. And so I do encounter a lot of people who are like, wait a minute, it can't be. So really bringing forth those voices.
I think to follow up on Cheyney, even this the people who did not own enslaved individuals, like George was saying, the people that were the northern factories that are making shoes and clothing, the textile mills, just because you don't own someone does not mean you don't benefit from the labor or the economic system. One of a community collaborator that I've collaborated with in the past, Katrina Brown, her family founded Brown University, and most of our older academic institutions can trace their lineage back to slavery, either being paid for by or built by the labor of enslaved individuals, using medical schools, experimenting on the bodies of African-American women and children especially, but also African-American men. So if you look at for the Brown family, looking at they're building ships in New England to sail those ships to take raw material to be offloaded, selling goods in West Africa, taking enslaved individuals from West Africa and selling them into enslavement in the Caribbean, especially in Cuba, and then coming back to the United States or the colonies. And so this idea that that if you're in the North, just in your shipbuilder means your hands free. Well, you might be building a ship that was meant for carrying enslaved cargo. You might be might be a rope maker making the rigging to make those ships. You might be a sail maker, a shoemaker. So just because you're not buying someone on the auction block in Charleston, South Carolina, or in Richmond, Virginia, it does not mean your hands are clean from the institution of enslavement.
Exactly.
And the nature of a lot of these economies are based on supporting enslavement. I just wanted to share a book that I have as required reading for the interpreters that work with me. It's called Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, and that's by Anne Farrow.
Yeah. And Cheney, you make a great point there. I think when we arm ourselves with firsthand, background information, firsthand sources, when we thoroughly research and we get into these environments where we may be confronted with someone who is just a little bit combative or at least tends to seek a conflict, having the knowledge and being able to point back to great sources is very disarming as well. When we go back to original sources, that's something that's not debatable, right? And anyone who would like to debate us, our challenge is to bring us your information and let's compare notes and let's see where it lands. But we go into these discussions with total confidence that we have researched the background of the subject matter and it's undisputed. We go to events and our position is that we're not here to debate. This is our perspective and it's based on research. Sometimes it's hard to digest. Either you accept it or you don't, but we're not at events to engage in debate.
Dovetailing on that, what sources, I know our mutual friend Emmanuel Dabney put a list of sources together to help understanding African-American experience. And I know Mia, before the broadcast, held up a book that she particularly enjoyed. Maybe each one of you could mention a source or two that if people wanted to read more and learn more about what you're interpreting, I think that'd be helpful if you wouldn't mind doing that.
Absolutely. And Mia, you want to start with that book you have?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So, and read, because it basically goes through how basically the history of America of it as far as all came from, and being the history that we do, it's so challenging, but at the same like this that is so thick with of racist ideas in America. Important because, as my colleagues were saying, when we are at an event, we might have questions come to us from out of nowhere. And there's so much strength as a group. If I can't remember a quotation or a source, my colleague can, and of collected knowledge. But for someone who may not know the fabric of what was going on for slavery to run so rampant and the racist idea is great and very, very important. And I would recommend it.
Okay.
And before we continue, and thank you for you all who are posting those links in our comments section. Emmanuel's chiming in.
Okay, great.
Shepherd Madge. Yeah, if you all don't mind keeping it going, that's awesome. Dr. Kendi is now going to, I think it's Boston University. He just left America.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, just an incredible scholar. So thank you all in the comments section for facilitating as well. So please continue.
So let me take a stab at this one. One of my favorite sources is, in the 1930s, the Work Progress Administration, the WPA, they embarked on this task to, they wanted to create work for Americans. And so they got a bunch of journalists to go out and interview ex-slaves, those who were formerly enslaved, and to get their view of what life was like during the period before they all died. Again, if we're talking about 1930, versus 1860, it's time to get these stories or we lose them. And the way they organized it was to assign someone to go to every state. And a compilation was made of the slave narratives from the state of Virginia, and then a separate one from the state of North Carolina, and then from Tennessee, and then from Alabama. All of the southern states and most of the border states had a compilation of slave narratives. I like that because you get firsthand what the experience was from the slaves. Now, granted, the presentation, it was, oh, by the way, is written in slave dialect. They were written in slave dialect, which is good. But the presentation can sometimes be viewed as tainted because they weren't trusting of the people that were taking down the information. They were skeptical about how the information would be used. So we have to wonder when you see from a person that, oh, life was good, and the master treated us really well. What was the real perspective, or were they really being truthful? But they contain a ton of information about the lives of those who were enslaved. And if we're doing an event in North Carolina, let's say, it's incumbent upon us to look at the slave narratives from North Carolina, so we could get that local, that regional perspective on what life was like. I love that source. Another one that I read in the last couple of years that I think is very powerful is called A Journey Through the Seaboard States. And authored by Frederick Law Olmsted.
Yeah.
And in 1852, he was a farmer. He was, living in New York from a wealthy family. But in 1852, he traveled to the southern states along the eastern seaboard, and he chronicled what he saw in agriculture versus agriculture in the north, and what he experienced in slavery. So you could see how the whole tone of slavery was changing from the state of Maryland to when you get to Northern Virginia, when you get to the Piedmont region of Virginia, it goes down to Tidewater, you get a different flavor. You go down into North Carolina, you see how people live there. Now, when he gets down to New Orleans, it's just a totally different world. And so by reading through his book, you could see how your lot was very different depending on where you were regionally. And that's been a powerful source. There's another book, and this is one of my sources for our period clothing. It's called New Raiments of Self, African-American Clothing in the Antebellum Period. And it really talks about the different variances in our clothing, the different sources of our clothing, how we even viewed clothing, how clothing was used to discriminate amongst slaves, how clothing was used to take away our self-esteem. And by that, I mean, they would sometimes dress women in men's clothes to strip away their femininity. And clothing could be used as a tool to really enforce those tenets of slavery. So those books have been very profound for me. I've got a whole list of about this big. I would say to anyone who's studying along the lines of the African-American experience, to pick up every book that you can from the period. You know, read what the Confederates thought, read what Union soldiers thought. And in many of the books, you know, you may not be searching specifically for the topic of what's going on with African Americans, but they may mention it. And by mentioning it, you get a very, very raw perspective on it. And it's important for us to entertain all of those different perspectives. So I say just
George,
read everything.
I wanted to interrupt you there. Project. One of, oh, am I delaying a little bit?
Yeah.
Breaking up. Sorry.
Okay. All right. I'll keep you going. So go on.
Okay.
It's too bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So Emmanuel Dabney has been kind enough to share the list that Dana referenced. Emmanuel has compiled some just really powerful source materials. George referenced the WPA slave narratives. I think someone's already commented on that, but they are available through the Library of Congress. And I think he highlighted the fact that they are an incredibly important source that's also problematic. And for more on that, I have an exercise with my students where there is an instance in which an African-American woman was interviewed twice by, in one instance, an African-American and another by a white interviewer. And the two narratives are actually quite different. The WPAs themselves are the recent subject of Jill Lepore's podcast called The Last Archive. She has a really thoughtful take on the WPAs. And so thank you all again for putting in the comments. Heidi just gave New Raiments of Self, the link to that. So thank you all so much. Emmanuel, thank you. I see them popping up here fast and furious. So we really appreciate the help. So we'll keep the conversation going here. Cheyney or Marvin, take it away. Yeah.
Any particular sources that you appreciate or would recommend?
Yeah, sorry.
I tend to think a lot about the economic weight of slavery. And so I'm sure there's a lot of books, but I really, The Half Has Never Been Told. And this is by Edward Baptist. And it just really gives you kind of a foot in the door in really connecting the slave trade as well as slavery within the economy and getting a better understanding. Also, the book that I talked about earlier, Complicity, really understanding how interwoven slavery was. As Marvin said, it's such a huge, I always say, if it wasn't for Africans in this country, there would be no United States of America. There would not be a United States of America because America wouldn't have had free labor to jumpstart their economy. They wouldn't have been able to kick out all of these cash crops to really develop our economy. So I think this is just a very important source. And I'm sure Marvin has a few as well.
Starting with the economy, one of it's written actually by economists. It's called Cotton, Race, and the Making of America. And as a person who is not into like economics whatsoever outside of historical economics, I thought it was a really fascinating look of an economist looking at cotton and how it just is interwoven in literally the fabric of America, and the economic system, and a breakdown of our founding fathers and their thoughts on slavery and race, and how the economics of America would be built on the backs of enslaved individuals. But also going to George's point, primary sources, looking at the actual words of individuals. Well, George mentioned the WPA narratives. Well, some of my favorites are actually books that were created by African Americans after they got their freedom. One of my favorites is The Life and Times of William Grimes, a runaway slave, who was from, I believe, Maryland or North Carolina, I think Maryland. And
Maryland.
he liberates himself. He's finally captured. He's finally tracked down by his enslaver, and he makes a deal where he would pay his enslaver for his freedom, and he does that. His enslaver crawfishes on the deal and says, "No, I want more money." So he has to sell his property. He's destitute and has no way of supporting himself, and so he writes this book in a way to gain money to survive. And one of the best is of his book, I think he says, "Were it not for the stripes on my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would in my will leave my skin as a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and bind the charter of American liberty. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of a happy and free America." And when you read that, and this is in the 1830s, I believe he writes this book. So it's like mind blowing that this man was able to write this book and publish it prior to the end of slavery, and sell it, as well as The Life and Times of the book by oh my goodness, she hid away as a Harriet Jacobs.
Oh, Harriet Jacobs.
Oh yeah.
Sure.
And
North Carolinian. Yeah.
Now if there's kids out there, I would not recommend it to your children, not until they get older. But those two narratives I think are some of my favorite, because they really get in those nitty gritty details. Now we also have to be careful with those narratives, because who are they writing for? They're writing for mainly northern white audiences. Yes, African Americans probably do pick up their book, but the majority of the readers are going to be northern or European audiences. So so what are they including? What are they excluding from these narratives to fit that? But those are Harriet Jacobs and William Grimes are probably my two top favorites that I would definitely recommend. And then lastly, there's a book by a man named Robert Roberts, and he was born into slavery in the 18th century. He gains his in Georgia, I believe, freedom. He worked as a waiting man in the 18th century, gains his freedom by the turn of the 19th century, and he winds up working as a waiting man for a northern politician, I believe a senator or a congressman, and he gains his freedom, and he retires in the 30s, I believe, as well, or 1840s, and he writes this waiting man's directory, and it's the first and maybe the only waiting man's directory of the 18th and 19th century. But he details out how to dress, when to dress in certain attire at certain times of the day, how to polish shoes, how to polish silver, anything you need to know about setting up a house or setting a table, or how to dress if you are working in a domestic setting, how to clean stains. I know I use some of his recipes, 18th century, 19th century recipes today to get things out. I'm like, oh, how do I shine my shoes to be the perfect? And this man has it. If you look at Robert Roberts' Waiting Man's Directory, it is there. I think it's 1828, I want to say, or 1838 it was published, but things like that, which aren't necessarily detailing the lives of people, but allow us to know the recipes, how to cook things, how to start shirts, things of that nature, how to look the part.
You know, there's a weight to what you do, your interpretation. I don't do it as much anymore because I am getting older, but when I would put on the uniform, I would go out and I would have fun, right? It was fun. How would you describe what you do? Do you find it fun to do this interpretation? Or is there a sort of a larger sense of duty and education that's overriding what you're doing?
I would say that it's duty and education.
Absolutely.
I was driving the other day, and an old childhood friend of mine, one of my first reenacting buddies, called me out of the blue. He just moved back to the United States from France, and we were talking about the old days. And he said he kind of talked about seeing my pictures on social media, and we hadn't spoken or seen each other in years. He said remember how we used to run around as kids and shoot, and we were probably 15, 16 years old doing this. And he's like, remember those days? And he's like, wow, you've changed over time. And I said, yeah, back in the day, I thought, I still love the people that I reenacted with back in the day. I still love those mentors. But my reason for doing it, I outgrew kind of playing cops and robbers, or I guess good guys Union versus bad guys Confederate as a child. But now I think the ancestors have called me for a higher purpose. I don't feel fulfilled if I'm on a battlefield just shooting. For me, there's no educational aspect to that. I'm not educating the public. I may be educating myself a little bit with tactics, but I'm not teaching anyone. And teaching runs in my family. And so for me, it's not fun, because Cheyney and I do this for a living. We interpret for a living. So right now I'm in my office, and on the weekends I will put on the attire and go someplace. In the evening, I'm going to put on the attire and go protest police brutality. So it's not a fun thing to do. It's a lifestyle. It's a choice it's something that if we're not doing it, who is? And if our ancestors could make it through enslavement, if our ancestors could make it through the Middle Passage, if our ancestors could make it through Bull Connor, if our ancestors could make it through the horrors of police brutality during the war on drugs, when these things weren't being videotaped and recorded, there's no reason that our interpretation can't have an impact. There's no reason to put on this out there and interpret our ancestors' history and make sure that their legacy and their voices are heard.
So Marvin, I think you nailed it. It's just an incredible sense of purpose that we go that we go into every event with. I just know that as we're preparing for events, we're on conference calls, we're trying to decide exactly what it's going to look like, and we just get so incredibly excited. One of the things that excites me is, just the impact that we can have, because when you look at who America is now, we've got African Americans, obviously white people, you've got people from India who are part of the American fabric. You've got people from Africa, from Central and South America, from Mexico. You've got Asians, and that's the fabric of America now. And you think about it, it's what knowledge base are they coming into this situation with? What do they know about the African American experience? And so it presents itself with an incredible opportunity to teach.
Absolutely.
Maybe they're coming into this historic environment with misconceptions. Maybe they come into this country with misconceptions of who African Americans are, or what our experience has been. And this is our opportunity to say, forget about what you heard. This is reality right here, okay? And I get so excited. I know that we all get so excited when you see the look on a visitor's face and they feel like they've been enlightened. They feel like they've learned something, came into that situation and they learned something that they had no idea happened in the past. That's the excitement that we get, and it makes it so purposeful what we do.
And when we're standing there, they're able to see not only the representation of the fact that each one of us is a descendant of an African enslaved person, but also the fact that we are wearing the fabrics. So just someone coming up to me at an event and they just want to feel how heavy it is and ask, what fabric is that? And then they want to know, wait, what are you eating? And all of a sudden, it's now not just a fact on a page, but we're the actual representation of someone who was there. And the humanizing aspect of it makes it so strong. And so when we're asked questions, it's so powerful, like George and Marvin and Cheyney were saying, when you see the looks on their faces, and finally they feel like, I'm just going to ask this question. And then when you can answer it, if they walk away with just some new knowledge of something, yes, in a way it's historical education, yes, but it isn't necessarily always easy for us to do and have to read through all of these narratives that are not easy to digest, because we hold a little bit of our DNA from people from that time. And when I remember reading over the WPA writers, the narratives, I remember my aunt telling me that when they had the 1940 census, they lied. And she said they were actually so frightened by this officer knocking on their door. And they opened the door and they thought they were going to be taken from their small South Carolina home that my family still lives in today, that my great-grandfather built himself. And basically he asked them a bunch of questions and they just said what they could, but then kept guarded about some things. And after I heard that as an inquisitive teenager, I knew that that was kind of my journey to asking more and learning about this. So what I appreciate about our group is that we come from different walks of life, as well as having family members and other types of information around us that we're able to bring to that event as a collective.
Wow. Well, your audio's fixed, and fortunately so, because that was powerful, very powerful.
Yeah.
And just because you haven't had a chance to speak much, Mia, because of that, you've done some interpretation in Europe, haven't you?
In Europe, yes, but mainly it's been to the States. So for the most part, I travel to the States once a year or so in order to join for events, but not anything Sons and Daughters of Ham related in Europe.
Okay.
Yes, so Dana, so although you'll see on social media, myself, Cheyney, Mia, Hugh, Jordan, a whole host of our group doing different programs around the country and around the world. We all do things independently as individuals, and then we come together as, like, with our powers combined. Together.
It's true. It's true.
It's so true. And I think it's so, going off of what Mia was talking about, I think it's so powerful that most of us have spoken with people who have experienced Jim Crow. Or people who have actually experienced Jim Crow in real time, but I grew up around people in South Carolina and Georgia as well, who I heard the stories firsthand. I have grown up on the stories, listening to the horror in their voices, and when they talk about having seen a hood, having seen a Ku Klux Klaner in person, face to face, actually talking to a family member, that's an experience that I feel almost entrusted. I feel compelled to tell these stories. We are their representatives here. A lot of these people never got the chance to tell their stories or to reach out and say, this is what happened. And a lot of them did not want to talk about it. I know some people in my family, they wanted to sit us down, and they seemed, talking about being compelled, they seemed almost compelled, like these words were being pushed out of their mouths at us and wanting to make sure that we didn't forget. And then there were others who experienced these things and never wanted to talk about them. And I would say that this is just in real time the trauma that I think we all have witnessed and we can speak to and say, these people were traumatized. And so I know if people in my grandmother's and great-grandmother's generation were so traumatized in this way, I can only imagine what their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents experienced.
So Cheney, you spoke of the trauma, and that's what life was like for those who were enslaved. And as hard as we try to interpret and then even recreate some aspects of those that were enslaved, some things we cannot duplicate. We can only describe what it was like. And on our best day, we couldn't recreate the wail of a mother as her child was being ripped away from her. You know, on our worst day, we couldn't feel that emotion of a husband knowing that in the next room, his wife was being abused by a master. On our worst day, we could not duplicate what it would smell like to work out in a field for a week in June, never bathe, wear the same clothes without washing those clothes for months on end. And so even though we do the research very thoroughly and try to recreate as best as we can, there are some things that we cannot, some points that we cannot get to. Our clothing may be accurate, but if you look at the pictures of some slaves, their clothing was just tattered and patched, and you might be able to recreate that. But if we wanted to look accurate, I think we'd have to run our clothing through a shredder. You know, I think
and you never know.
The level of dirt and filth, incomprehensible. But those are the things that we can describe and help people to understand just the entirety of the horror of slavery. So.
And I think we can all say that each of us knows an event that we've been to where we have shed tears. Because sometimes when you are there at events, what happens is that it hits you, and it just and it hits, and when it's there and you're seeing it and you're feeling it, and all of a sudden you get a little glimpse of, this is important. It's really important that I'm here. It's very important that I'm here. Thank you for asking this question, you know, to the public. Someone who asks a question that all of a sudden you're able to let your guard down and you're able to just say everything, and they take it and embrace it. And I think those kinds of interactions are so important. So I've had people who have asked, why would you portray a certain persona that seems so hard to portray? And that's exactly the reason why, is that because we spend so much time researching the history of this and being able to educate the public and being able to just share and using that opportunity for that curiosity to be there is so important.
And Jim, I think you can speak to this too. We've seen those interactions at the Harper's Ferry Living History. And I've seen what you're in firsthand what Mia is describing, because you know, I don't know if Jim might want to speak to that event and how the reactions it triggered from the onlookers.
Well, you know, I often think about how audiences sort of consume history. And of course, you know, many people read the works that you all have cited or will read them. But I think audiences also consume a lot of history through popular culture, but also at historic sites. So the big question always is, what exactly is the historic site representing? And historic sites like Monticello, Mount Pelier, Mount Vernon, Colonial Williamsburg have done a great deal to create much more holistic narratives. But I think there's this overriding idea, especially about the Civil War era, and unfortunately, I've even seen reflected in our comments section, that this is a contest like maybe only about the military aspects about the war. And instead, this is a very complex event, a reckoning that never really achieves a reconciliation that doesn't have any justice. And so I think at these historic sites, when individuals such as the sons and daughters of Ham are present, audiences can have a much more holistic understanding, not only of the past, but then engage in a much more broad series of conversations, which we must be having as Americans. And I mean, the power with which you spoke today and the elegance is just remarkable. The comments have been just incredibly effusive in that regard. And so maybe we can end on that hopeful note then. I mean, you all just had beautiful words. And and unless you have any final sentiments, I think we can close it with that. Is that fair?
So,
okay.
It's been a tremendous honor to spend this time talking to you, because, you know, as Jim and I have seen you in the field doing your interpretation, it's spectacular and it's needed, and it's so well done. And you talking about emotion to me, as some of the descriptions you were just giving had me sort of on the edge myself. I mean, it's very, very powerful.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Jim. I think like today more than any other, it's obviously Juneteenth is tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're most of us. So happy Juneteenth, everyone.
Right.
And we're obviously still grappling with the idea of police brutality. And Confederate monuments are being pulled down throughout the country. I think right now our country is hopefully is finally not just going to remove the images, but start a national conversation about race, about racism, about white supremacy in our country. And I am blessed to be part of such a great group that not just the four of us here, but not just the sons and daughters of Ham, but all African American interpreters, all interpreters of color, because it's not just African American interpreters who are coming out now and doing awesome works. There's our Latinx brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, our Indian brothers and sisters, our Native American brothers and sisters are I'm starting to see more of an online presence there. And so I think having a national conversation around race and reconciliation, and like you said, Jim, in a healthy manner, as opposed to northern white people and southern white people saying, okay, let bygones be bygones, but let's talk about our past trauma, and let's try to heal from it.
Yeah. Absolutely. So in the comments, there have been some questions about the respective organizations. People want to find out more. Many links have been